heard the conventional view.
Now prepare yourself to hear the other side.
High school teachers Mike Margison and Justin Spears bring you the alternative view you didn't get in the classroom. Now here they are, Margison, and Spears.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Other Side, September 23rd, 2018. We're coming at you. I'm Mr. Margison, and with me always is Mr. Justin Spears. Justin, happy fall.
Yes, it came in and made its presence known here in central Indiana. We went from, I believe it was like 90 on Thursday. By the end of the day, Friday, I think we were down into maybe the low 60s. We had a pretty chilly day on Saturday as well. So yes, fall is here. It has made its presence known, which is kind of nice. Was outdoors a lot this weekend, and it was a little bit of a reprieve from the week of being out in that hot weather. So yeah, definitely prepared for a little bit of a cool down here and looking forward to the fall season. So we're going to get rocking and rolling here tonight, guys. Welcome to The Other Side. You can hear our show in many different formats, as we always talk about here. Just want to kind of run through that for our listeners real quick. If you just happen to be catching this for the first time, welcome. And if you've listened to us, thank you for being with us here and for all your support and help in sharing the show. You can hear us on our Spreaker radio app page, and that's at Margison and Spears. The Other Side with Margison and Spears on Spreaker Radio. That is an app that you can download through Google Play. That show also then gets seeded through iTunes and Google Play. So you can get our podcast through iTunes or Google Play podcasts. And again, that's just The Other Side with Margison and Spears. So those are some mobile ways if you like listening to podcasts on the go on your mobile device in your car. Those are some mobile options there. If you're around the office or at home and you've got some time to listen via YouTube, our library on our YouTube page is available. You can just search Mike Justin, The Other Side, and you'll be able to find our YouTube page. We are also a part of the Cerberus Radio Network, which is an online radio conglomerate. We've got several different shows through Cerberus. Suzanne Sherman, Mark Kreslins, Jeff Johnson. They all have shows. Case in Point and the Wasatch Report are Suzanne's shows. Mark and Suzanne have the Mark and Suzanne show. There's some great insight from those minds over there. And again, if you search Cerberus Radio Network on Facebook or through Radio Co., you will be able to find the channels and all the episodes from shows through the Cerberus Radio Network. And last but certainly not least, here locally in West Central Indiana out of Crawfordsville, 92.1, 1550 AM WCVL. We'd like to thank them, as always, for the efforts that they put in bringing the show every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. Again, that's 1550, 92.1 FM WCVL. That's WCVLAM.com if you'd like to listen online. Saturday mornings at 8 a.m., a rebroadcast of the show. So, a number of different ways that you can get involved with listening to the show. You can contact us through our social media accounts, Margison and Spears at gmail.com. If you'd like for us to email us, we would love to hear from you, good, bad, what you think we need to work on. We're open to hearing it all. So having said that, we are, if you've been listening here recently, in a series on the presidents. And tonight we take on what I think is really an interesting, from a historical perspective, look. And that is President Theodore Roosevelt, because what we've got going on here is a period of time in which there's a lot of, I don't want to say tension, but just drama, I guess, maybe. Imagine that in politics, in political parties. And so I want Mike, kick us off here and talk to us a little bit about who Theodore Roosevelt was. And, you know, when you think a little bit, you know, as we say, the side that you don't get in the textbook, you know, talk to us a little bit about what Roosevelt stood for in this era known as the Progressive Era.
Yeah, sure. And it's not just that there was a lot of drama during this time period. This was a time of monumental change. If you just think about all of the inventions that start popping up in the late 19th century, and now we're turning the chapter and going into the 20th century. It was an era of big change. And Roosevelt himself was a larger than life figure. This guy's character was just off the charts. But let's back up real quick. So, what do we know about Teddy Roosevelt? Well, he's extremely popular among leftist historians, I guess not so much libertarian or right-leaning historians, and he ranks near the top of virtually every presidential ranking. And when we were doing Andrew Johnson a couple weeks ago, we talked about presidential rankings and how Johnson himself is at the bottom. If you look at the top, you're going to see TR in the top probably 3 or 4 of virtually every poll. He's on Mount Rushmore, right? So he's got to be good, right? He's up there with Jefferson and Washington. Well, hold on. So, like, is all of this adulation, is it justified? And what we're going to do here is we're going to give you the other side of President Teddy Roosevelt. First, a little background information on the guy. He is or was pretty accomplished, self-educated. He was homeschooled. He got into politics at an early age in his 20s. He was also an accomplished historian and an author, wrote a very popular book at the time on the naval battles during the War of 1812. He was a governor of New York. He was assistant secretary of the Navy. He was a vice president and ultimately president of the United States. And not to mention the fact that he commanded a cavalry division in the Spanish-American War known as the Rough Riders, which some people may have heard of that too. There isn't a lot that he didn't do. Teddy Roosevelt was notoriously active. I mean, he never rested. And this would actually be important because he brought that same energy to the White House. And that's an energy that I really don't think belonged there. Roosevelt, he was essentially the first modern liberal progressive president. And his thoughts, his ideas, the policies that he supported, they were almost indistinguishable from modern day liberals. If you listen to him talk about regulation or, some of the things that he supported, like a highly progressive income tax, he had total disdain for the wealthy. It sounds like it could be coming from the mouth of Barack Obama or Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer. And I mean, when I say that he had disdain for the wealthy, he hated the wealthy, and he wasn't afraid to say so. He said so on many occasions. In fact, one quote here, it says, quote, "Too much cannot be said against men of great wealth." And he also spoke of his intention to, quote, "punish the wealthy." He thought that was one of his roles as president. And herein kind of lies the folklore surrounding Teddy Roosevelt. And this is going to be one of the things that I choose to focus on. He was the trust buster, right? That's what we learn about him in the textbook. This is what the average high school kid knows about Teddy Roosevelt, is that he pursued this relentless and aggressive agenda against greedy corporations. And he did it on behalf of the little guy. He offered a, quote, square deal. That was his terminology. He used that on several occasions, but he would offer a, quote, square deal for the average American. And what that basically amounted to was a whole bunch of government safeguards. And what I want to do for a second here is contrast that with the guy that we talked about last week, Grover Cleveland. I mean, Roosevelt sees it as his role to offer all of these government safeguards. In just less than 2 decades prior, Grover Cleveland was president. And you remember we talked about his veto of the Texas seed bill. And this was a quote that Justin read and I repeated because I thought it was so important. But here is Cleveland's message in that veto. It says, quote, "Federal aid in such cases," we're talking about appropriating money to Texas farmers for seed. "Federal aid in such cases encourages the expectation of paternal care on the part of the government and weakens the sturdiness of our national character," end quote. Roosevelt was absolutely the opposite. He felt that paternal role was necessary for the government, and that the people were the children. And in fact, actually, all of the previous presidents, not just Cleveland, but all of our previous presidents that we've discussed on the show, were way closer to Grover Cleveland than they were to Roosevelt. He was a new kind of president, and that, the guys we talked about, Washington or Martin Van Buren or Andrew Johnson, and there were also a couple in there that we didn't get to talk about who I really would have liked to, James K. Polk, John Tyler. They were all pretty much cut from the same cloth. During the 19th century, you abided by the Constitution, you showed fidelity to the Constitution, and all of the battles, the political battles, were about whether or not the Constitution would allow you to do this. Well, Roosevelt couldn't stand the Constitution. It was a major impediment to all the things that he wanted to do. He wanted an income tax. Remember, there wasn't one yet. That would be about 10 years later before we got one. He wanted to redistribute national income. He thought that that was important. He wanted to put all sorts of heavy restrictions on American businesses, many of which he was actually able to get through. But I want to go back to the trust busting for a second, because that's really what Teddy Roosevelt is known for. And well, he did initiate a ton of antitrust legislation. Really, what bothers me is, does anyone stop to ask how prevalent monopolies were in the early 20th century? I mean, this is what Teddy Roosevelt is kind of known for, but we should at least ask, did we need trust busting? And what I'm going to tell you here, actually, historian Jim Powell, who has a number of great books, he did all the legwork here. I'm basically reading off of a paper that he published. But when we look at this time period here at the end of the 19th century and spilling into the beginning of the 20th century, we do see that businesses were getting bigger. That's true. But were they acting in monopolistic fashion? That's the important question. In fact, so what we say here is, were they restricting output and driving up prices? That's what a monopoly does, and that's why people don't like them, right? They restrict output and then they drive up prices. And first of all, businesses, even though they were getting richer and they were growing bigger, they were actually losing market share during this time period. They were losing market share due to competition. Monopolies, if you're a monopoly, you gain market share. You eventually gain 100% of the market share. You don't lose it. And throughout this time, output was expanding while prices were falling. This is precisely the 180-degree opposite of what you would see if monopolies were dominating the economy. So let's look at some of the biggest companies, right? Like the biggest boogeymen and all the damage that they were doing to the poor American consumer. We'll start with steel companies. Were they restricting output and raising prices? Well, let's see. Steel production was 20 times greater in 1910 than it had been just 3 decades prior in 1880. That certainly does not represent a restriction of output. It was 20 times greater over those 3 decades. Oil companies, right? Oil production was 10 times higher over the same period. And Standard Oil, this is one of the famous ones. The Standard Oil, of course, had to be broken up. But they were one of the victims of the era's trust busting. Food manufacturers, they were very much in Roosevelt's crosshairs. But food production was up over 4 times during the same period. Clothing production was up 5 times. In fact, across the economy, there were 400,000 more commercial and industrial firms in 1910 than there had been in 1890. Now, let me repeat that. There are more firms, 400,000 more firms. In monopolistic environments, there are supposed to be fewer firms, way fewer, not way more. And what about prices? All right, prices are supposed to be going up while the monopolistic firms just kind of gouge everybody. We'll look at J.D. Rockefeller. Right? He's the big one of these big guys. Oil was going for about $15 a barrel in 1860. It sold for less than $1 a barrel every single year from 1879 to the end of the century. And then kerosene, which was his primary product, that went from 80 cents a gallon to just 3 cents a gallon over that same time period. And you're going to see a similar story with steel. You'll see it with freight, with automobiles. Just about everything of importance to the average American decreased in price, not rose. And production numbers went up, not down. And not only that, the reason production numbers went up, it's just not like one company was producing more things. There were more companies. There were more companies competing with each other. And when they compete with each other, they do so to offer better products. You have Macy's and Marshall Fields and Woolworths, Montgomery Ward, Kroger, all of them competing for customers by offering more things at lower prices, not the other way around. So Roosevelt is basically, he is liked because he is a big government liberal, but much of his myth is grossly exaggerated. He was fighting a boogeyman that wasn't exactly there. And it's this, I was looking at one of these metrics. I think we might have even talked about this with the Andrew Johnson one. One of the metrics for what made a great president in one of these new polls was executive energy. I really don't know what that means, but Teddy Roosevelt ranked number one among these modern presidential historians. But again, we don't stop to ask, does the Constitution call for a single person to have executive energy? And Teddy thought that there was no problem, and he spoke so. He said these words exactly. He sees no problem with power being consolidated in the hands of one man. And that was his approach to the presidency, and that's why he's so popular among big government leftist historians. But that's effectively all he was. He was just really, really liberal, not so much a great president. Justin, you with me?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's great stuff there, and really appreciate that. I was kind of reading through as you were saying that. I'm sorry if I missed a segue there. You were talking earlier about how the textbook would present Roosevelt, and I was just reading a passage here. It says Roosevelt was not interested in bringing down all large companies. He saw a difference between good trust and bad trust. Big business could often be more efficient than small ones. He believed big business was bad, he said, only if it bullied smaller companies or cheated consumers. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with what you were talking about there at the end just a second ago with the whole notion of using the power of the presidency. If you allow that to happen, then you allow this one person the ability to be able to pick and choose what is, okay and not okay. And that, the book goes on to say, well, some critics said that wasn't fair of him to do that. And they may have even thought that to be unconstitutional. And then it goes on to say, despite such criticisms, most Americans were pleased with the antitrust protections. It's just, it's unbelievable.
Let me stop right there. That's a really good point. Most Americans were pleased. Okay, the Constitution, nowhere in it does it say that the president has to abide by the will of the people. That there is nothing about that. The president have to do what the Constitution says. This idea that most Americans are in support of it is totally irrelevant. And you see that stuff a lot. We talk about today and I don't want to get too far off topic because I know you want to get into the foreign affairs, but we hear about, most Americans support the Affordable Care Act. Well, what difference does that make? The question is not whether most Americans support it. It's whether or not the federal government has constitutional authority to manage my healthcare decisions.
That's exactly right. And that's, the main reason why the framers did not build this new system of government to be a direct democracy. There's a reason why we entrust our representatives and delegate authority to them to create legislation that is supposed to be just and wise. Now, obviously, they don't always do that. But the whole point here is that we're saying is the reason that we are not a direct democracy is because we wouldn't want the will of the people to guide us. The will of the people oftentimes is very misguided. And you can imagine where we would be today if we governed based solely off of what the majority of people wanted. That's a scary thought that we might even be further off the rails than where we already are. So, I wanted to hit a little bit here on Roosevelt and his foreign policy. And I thought your explanation of his usage of the office is very apt here in talking about the man in his role as president dealing with foreign countries. And probably one of the most important events that went down during his presidency was the issue of dealing with the Panama Canal. Now, if I had more time, we could walk through all of the steps, but it would probably take a couple of hours to go through everything that was going on with France, trying to get in and build the canal. And then you bring in Colombia, and then you've got the bloodless overthrow. And it's just, what I want to look at here is what was President Roosevelt's duty and obligation in dealing with a foreign country. And you kind of talked a little bit about it, and we're going to bring a couple of things that you talked about back together here with this event. And that is, what does the Constitution say is the president's authority in dealing with foreign relations. And I was reading through it earlier today, just making sure I hadn't missed anything, kind of dotting my I's, crossing my T's. And really, all that is specifically, explicitly, expressly stated in the Constitution as it relates to foreign relations is the duty to make treaties, so long as they are ratified by the Senate, right? That's one of the things that we'll talk a little bit about here in a second. But the idea that he has the ability to create executive agreements that usually are, I think, what the Constitution kind of lays out as, like, not trivial matters, but just things that don't necessarily need to go through the formal process of having to bring the Senate in. And you can tell from Roosevelt's kind of tenor here that he's irritated by this process. And you brought up the idea earlier of sounding like modern presidents. And let me just throw this out here and listen to this here and tell me what your thoughts are on this. If I read this quote to you, you would absolutely think that, oh yeah, President Obama said this. The Affordable Health Care Act would not have been started if I had not taken hold of it. Because if I had followed the traditional or conservative method, I should have submitted an admirable state paper occupying a couple of hundred of pages detailing all of the facts to Congress and asking Congress's consideration of it. In that case, there would have been a number of excellent speeches made on the subject in Congress. The debate would be proceeding at this moment with great spirit, and the beginning of the work on the Affordable Health Care Act would be 50 years in the future. Fortunately, the crisis came in a period when I could act unhampered. Accordingly, I took control of health care, started to nationalize it, and left Congress not to debate the Affordable Health Care Act, but to debate me. Now, if you heard that, right, you would think that that legitimately sounds like something that Barack Obama would say. Doesn't that sound right?
Absolutely.
Okay, what I just read to you is a direct quote from Theodore Roosevelt, obviously changing out Affordable Health Care Act for the Panama Canal. He literally says the Panama Canal would not have been started if I had not taken hold of it. And then he goes on to say the rest as I spelled out there. And I think what really is the most troublesome thing and really hits the nail on the head in terms of how Roosevelt used the office of the presidency as the chief executive of this country is because if I had followed the traditional or conservative method, meaning had I been following the Constitution and constrained by what the document says, I should have submitted an admirable state paper occupying a couple hundred pages, so on and so forth. In other words, he's saying I should have let Congress do their job here with this. Instead, I didn't. I seized control and I did what I wanted to. And this is commonly referred to as the stewardship theory of the presidency, which kind of holds that executive power was limited only by specific restrictions and prohibitions appearing in the Constitution or imposed by the Congress under its constitutional powers. And it's that last clause there that so accurately defines, I think, in my opinion, as you kind of reflect back and again, looking at the Panama Canal, looking at trust busting, looking at all the other pieces of legislation that went through during this period of time, basically Roosevelt was a bully. He went and said, I'm going to do what I want to do. Congress was too yellow-bellied, too weak, too fractured, whatever, excuse you want to make for it. The reality is that they let the president run with what he wanted to do. And you can hear, too, also, just as a side note with this, just the pure arrogance in his voice and in his writing. He goes on to say, no single great material work which remains to be undertaken on this continent is of such consequence to the American people as the building of a canal across the isthmus connecting North and South America. It is emphatically a work which it is for the interest of an entire country to begin and complete as soon as possible. It is one of those great works which only a great nation can undertake with prospects of success, and which, when done, are not only permanent assets in the nation's material interests, but standing monuments to its constructive ability. So he's basically just saying that America, irregardless of what its position is and should be, we are a great country. Therefore, we have great power. Therefore, we have the ability to come in and bully our way into another sovereign country's foreign affairs and take over a project which will showcase to the world that we have the ability to do whatever we want to do when we want to do it. There's pockets aren't deep enough, for us to be able to do this. And I think that's an interesting point too, because there's such a huge payoff on this thing, to the land lease of this, to the rights to it, to paying off the Colombians, and yet here's a guy who doesn't like big corporations, but he's okay with big government doing it. Just can't be a private company doing it. And so again, you see the contradictions here. You see the absolute trampling over the Constitution with this. And again, this is where it starts to get in a little bit more to some of the problems related to what went on with Panama being under the control of Colombia, there being some quote unquote rebels down in Panama, and conveniently for Roosevelt and the government, they were able to back those rebels into fighting for independence, so that we wouldn't have to deal with the Colombians on getting access in to the canal. We had already paid off the French for what work they had started doing on it a couple of years earlier. But the thing that I think is important to note here with this is looking at the numbers here. Since the president's actions didn't go unopposed back home, with some calling it an act of sword conquest, but the United States started its Panama Canal project in, I believe it was 1911 or 1912. The 10-year endeavor cost $375 million and over 5,600 lives. And obviously so many, seeing America as this imperial power, the damage to the reputation. Obviously in Central America, especially with Mexico, you already have some animosity. Now you've pushed it further down into Central and South America. There was starting to build a sense of regret for the way that the American government had abused trust, basically, and the way that they had dealt with this entire situation. Was really something that, again, when you go back and you look at what does the Constitution grant authority to the executive to do in this arena, I can find no justifiable cause or reason why we could legally, through the Constitution, be meddling in this, other than the fact that it looked good because it was a situation where Roosevelt could take charge. And as you said and pointed out earlier, that was who he was. He was a man of action. So the appearance of him on a bulldozer, that was a PR stunt. That was something that looked good. It was something that would help with the worldview of America, right? And by that I mean, people could look to the United States and say, wow, they got that done where the French failed. The Americans were able to come in and clean it up. And not only that, but they helped win Panama their independence without having to fight a war. But you don't look at it from the other side and see the damage to the reputation. I think, from somebody who's an ego-driven person, they're only going to see it from that one perspective. And then finally, which I think, again, is something that goes back to what we talked about earlier, the time that this would save for shipping materials between the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean. Yes, it would cut down on that time, and it would make things cheaper to do that. But there again, it's very contradictory to the way that Roosevelt was treating businesses back in the United States during this period of time, just randomly picking and choosing who he saw as a good big business or a bad big business. Again, you have another decision being made at the executive level here. And, I just want to wrap up by saying this is what the founders were worried about. This is what Benjamin Franklin said in the Constitutional Convention when he's warning the convention, as Hamilton basically is calling for a tyrant leader, a king, that if somebody has, as you said, the right word there, executive energy, to be able to do whatever they decide needs to be done, Constitution be damned, look at this and say, this calls for action. I'm a man of action. Let me act. But that's not the way the government is set up. And it's set up that way on purpose. The division, the separation of powers, the checks and balances, the fact that if you look at it from another perspective, commander in chief, but I can't get a declaration of war. Who do I have to get that from? You have to get that from Congress. Why? Because we don't want somebody going around willy-nilly declaring war against countries without thinking it through properly, going through a larger body that's really going to put it through the ringer. Yes, it may cause a delay in some action, but bad things happen when we move quickly. Even if you think it's justified that we move quickly, usually it results in something bad happening later on down the road. And I think that's a situation where you saw this with Roosevelt is, again, people look at the final result. Oh, yeah, you got this canal built, but the damage that was done and the precedent that it set. You're going to get Woodrow Wilson to come in and look at the platform that you've now left for him to be able to operate on. And it's no wonder why, among other reasons, why he is such a bad president. I mean, he was probably able to take a look at, well, look what my predecessor did. Why can't I do that? Why can't I do it in the way that I want to do it? Oh, I know you thought you were doing it for the greater good of the people here, but I'm justifying it under that as well. So it really just sets a very dangerous precedent, and that's what I think the textbooks really miss here on Roosevelt. They want to focus on, yeah, he was taking it to big business. He was fighting for the little man. He had executive energy. He was a man of action. He was out there on the wilderness and going on hunts, and you just this manly, burly guy. And it's so easy to get caught up in that narrative and shove all that other stuff aside and say, yeah, we really don't want to talk about the fact that he overstepped the constitutional authority. We really don't want to talk about the fact that he cost the taxpayers almost $400 million back in the early 1900s and over 5,000 lives. That's just a drop in the bucket. We don't want to talk about that. That is the shame of not really knowing the other side of a president like Roosevelt.
Well, that was some good foreshadowing, because we are going to be talking about Woodrow Wilson next week, who, again, very popular, very progressive, and I think that you kind of set the table there nicely. He now had somebody in front of him where he could look back and say, look, he just did it. TR just did it. So everything and Wilson was cut from the exact same cloth as Roosevelt, as we will see. All right, Justin, did you get everything you wanted to get?
Yeah, and I do want to make one more comment here just real quickly, and it relates back to the idea of setting the precedent. I was reading through our U.S. history textbook, as I was reading from earlier on trust busting, and I was also I had bookmarked a page from earlier today too, and it just tied into something I was thinking about here, where we talk about, again, Roosevelt with the overthrow of Panama, and it says it in two different spots, bloodless. And again, I don't think that is a mistake. I think that is done intentionally to get the reader, again, an impressionable young mind with a student here, to think governments can interfere with other governments and it can turn out okay. It can turn out without having it look like what the Middle East crisis has looked like since 9/11, where there's been, hundreds of thousands of lives lost. And so I think that's an intentional wording there to try to get people to understand that foreign manipulation and involvement doesn't always have to result in guerrilla warfare or bloody conflicts. But again, I think that is a very, very dangerous position to take, because yes, you may have gotten away with it, without it being a full-on battle. That really doesn't change the fact that you're meddling in a sovereign country's affairs. I mean, what do we hear about in the news today with Russia? Is what Russia doing a bloodless meddling in foreign affairs? Of course it is, but we're irate about it, right? So now that the shoe's on the other foot, it's okay when we did it back in the early 1900s, but 180 years later, all of a sudden, or however long it's been, it's a huge issue, right? Oh, you get the Russians out of here, they're doing this. How can we justify it in one sense, but not in another? And again, just understanding the dangerous precedent that sets, I think, is very, very important.
Well, if your guiding principle is that the ends justify the means, then you're correct. That is extremely dangerous. And that is the guiding principle for leftists. And that was the guiding principle of the extreme left for much of the 20th century. So I think that that was very well put. Well, we want to thank you for joining us here on The Other Side. And we hope that you were able to get something out of that. And we encourage you, no matter if we're talking about Martin Van Buren or Teddy Roosevelt or Andrew Johnson, always do look at it from another perspective. There are different ways to view these people. So again, thank you for listening. We look forward to being with you next week when we talk about Woodrow Wilson. And you have now heard The Other Side.
Thanks for listening. And remember, you're not fully informed until you've heard the other side.